In the deep stillness of the Giza Plateau, the Great Sphinx watches a horizon with eyes that have seen the rise and fall of every human empire. We have long measured its limestone body, but modern senses are now whispering of something that defies the natural world. Beneath the right forepaw, seismic pulses have detected symmetrical voids and metallic resonance where there should be only solid bedrock. It is a discovery that challenges everything we know about the dawn of civilization. What if the lion is not a tomb, but a machine, or perhaps a sentinel guarding a legacy of gears and logic from a forgotten age? If you find yourself drawn to these stories of ancient mystery and truth, please consider subscribing. A gentle press on the like button helps keep these journeys into the unknown coming. Now, let us look into the mechanical heart of the desert. In the deep stillness of the Giza Plateau, the Great Sphinx watches a horizon with eyes that have seen the rise and fall of every human empire. We have long measured its limestone body, but modern senses are now whispering of something that defies the natural world. Beneath the right forepaw, seismic pulses have detected symmetrical voids and metallic resonance where there should be only solid bedrock. It is a discovery that challenges everything we know about the dawn of civilization. What if the lion is not a tomb, but a machine, or perhaps a sentinel guarding a legacy of gears and logic from a forgotten age? If you find yourself drawn to these stories of ancient mystery and truth, please consider subscribing. A gentle press on the like button helps keep these journeys into the unknown coming. Now, let us look into the mechanical heart of the desert. In 1991, a team of scientists stood in the cool shadow of the Great Sphinx, aiming seismic sensors at the base of the monument. They were searching for something that officially should not exist. They were looking for an echo. Thomas DeBecke, a geophysicist, and Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, directed low-frequency sound waves into the limestone floor between the pores of the massive sentinel. What bounced back from the depths stunned them. It was not the messy, jagged signature of natural, fractured rock. Instead, the data revealed a clear, rectangular silhouette. Deep beneath the right forepaw, at a depth of nearly 25 feet, the instrument detected a symmetrical void. It was geometric, perfectly aligned, and deep. The instruments whispered of a hollow space shaped like a perfect chamber, buried under a solid limestone foundation that had supposedly been undisturbed for thousands of years. The discovery was a shock to the scientific community, but the strangest part was not the reading itself. It was the fact that someone had already described this exact chamber 60 years earlier. His name was Edgar Cayce. In the early 1930s, from a modest house in Virginia, Cayce would close his eyes, fall into a trance, and begin speaking about a secret history of the world. He was known as the Sleeping Prophet, a man who claimed to access a collective memory of a vanished age. He insisted that a hidden vault slept below the pores of the Sphinx, guarding the record of a civilization that had been destroyed by a global catastrophe. He called it the Hole of Records. He claimed to contain the story of humanity's true beginnings, preserved by survivors of a great flood who had traveled from a lost continent to the Nile Valley. When modern sensors pulsed over the exact coordinates Cayce had drawn from a trance 6 decades earlier, myth and measurement collided for the first time. For skeptics, it was a coincidence of impossible proportions. For others, it was the first crack in the story of human history itself. In those early years of the 20th century, Cayce's voice was recorded by typists who worked by lamplight, capturing syllables that sounded like an echo from another age. One stenographer later described how her hands would tremble as she wrote, not from a lack of belief, but from the eerie certainty in his tone. He spoke like someone who was reading a blueprint from memory. On a map tacked above his desk, His followers drew the outline of the Sphinx and shaded the ground between its paws, labeling it simply with a question mark. To the people around him, it sounded like folklore with footnotes. He gave coordinates specific enough to be mapped decades before technology could peer beneath the stone body of the lion. He insisted the chamber would be found in the 1990s, a detail that would age from prophecy to a chilling scientific alignment. Critics in his lifetime dismissed these readings as mystical invention. Archaeologists regarded his claims as fringe spirituality wrapped in pseudo-geography. They argued that the Giza Plateau was one of the most studied locations on Earth, and that if a giant secret vault existed, someone would have found it by now. Yet, among his stenographers and archivists, small curiosities persisted. They wondered why a man with no formal training in geology or Egyptian history would pinpoint that exact spot. Casey never claimed to be awake when these revelations arrived. Instead, he drifted into altered states, half sleeping and half speaking, while words spilled through him like dictation from somewhere beyond his own memory. He talked of lost continents and of civilizations that once could harness energies forgotten by modern science. But among all the predictions that passed through his lips, the whole of records beneath the right paw of the Sphinx returned with haunting precision. By the mid-20th century, the archive of his readings, stored by the Association for Research and Enlightenment, became a seed for future expeditions. When the 1990s finally arrived, researchers did indeed sweep ground sensors beneath the paws, chasing anomalies that rolled from below the sand like faint heartbeats. Most observers regarded it as a fascinating alignment of storytelling and science, an old prophecy meeting the hum of a modern instrument. Inside the small offices of the Casey Foundation, the late-night rituals of cataloging these secrets continued long after his death. Assistants turned his syllables into index cards stored alphabetically. Atlantis, Egypt, prophesize, Sphinx. They kept one eye on his specific descriptions, waiting for a day when the stone would be forced to give up its truth. The description Casey offered of the age of the Sphinx clashed directly with accepted history. He dated the monument to around 10,000 years before Christ, an era that archaeologists saw as prehistory, long before the rise of organized states or formal irrigation. To the professionals, the claim broke both timelines and patience. Yet, in his readings, Casey insisted the monument was older than the pyramids by thousands of years. He said it was built by exiles who wanted to leave a signal for those who would forget the past. That phrasing caught the imagination of many because it sounded less like a grand myth and more like a set of instructions. It was a relic meant to be activated one day rather than merely admired. By the time the seismic teams took interest in 1991, those instructions seemed to echo in unexpected places. Working with Robert Schoch, Thomas DeBecke directed waves through the limestone to read density changes underground. Their findings, presented publicly, noted shapes that were too regular to be simple cracks or voids. Though he was careful with his language, DeBecke admitted surprise at how symmetrical the anomaly seemed. Such details sounded exactly like the outlines Casey had spoken of. The Casey Foundation had even supported parts of that research financially. For the critics, this blurred uncomfortable borders. It was science entangled with faith. They questioned how objective the data could be when it was funded by people who were looking for a prophecy to prove itself. Yet others saw the partnership as a poetic symmetry, like two worlds meeting halfway. One sent vibrations through the stone, while the other sent them through a trance. Among mainstream Egyptologists, the reaction ranged from irritation to unease. Zahi Hawass, who oversaw the excavations around the Sphinx, openly dismissed talk of secret vaults as a Western fantasy. He argued that the anomalies could be natural fissures from ancient seismic activity, a mundane explanation shaped like a mystery. Still, some reports claim that he authorized brief follow-up investigations, possibly to satisfy curiosity or to keep control over whatever narrative might form if outsiders continued their search unchecked. The results of those deeper studies were never fully released to the public, ensuring that theories only multiplied in the gaps where the information thinned. For the followers of the sleeping prophet, however, the overlap was breathtaking. On the very spot where he had placed his hole of records, modern sensors had located a void roughly 25 feet beneath the surface. Whether it was a chamber, a fissure, or a coincidence, it was enough to reignite a century-old question. Could knowledge survive in stone, waiting for its rediscovery? Supporters suggested that the Sphinx might guard a message written not in ink, but in architecture. The whole of records was envisioned as a vault containing scrolls that chronicled the history of a lost world and its technologies. Casey envisioned humans who were once capable of channeling forces between the physical and the spiritual, bridging energy in ways forgotten after a great catastrophe. Many of his words felt like half metaphor and half memory. Beneath such phrasing lay a theme that appealed deeply to people living in a turbulent century. It was a dream that humanity had once been wiser, more connected, and might one day reunite with that source of understanding. For the academic community in Egypt, these claims threatened decades of careful chronology. The 4th dynasty timeline placed the Sphinx firmly within the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, about 2,500 years before Christ. Every temple alignment and quarry mark supported that range. To admit to any significant anomaly, even by geological happenstance, invited endless public speculation. In cafes from Cairo to London, these small details grew into larger debates. Could the most famous statue in the world sit atop something much older than its own civilization? The question refused to stay confined within scientific journals. It leapt to documentaries and late-night radio shows. Inside the archives in Virginia, the staff watched this unfold with quiet satisfaction. Some had once transcribed the coordinates themselves by hand. They had recorded latitude and placement as if they were mundane facts, never imagining they might later mirror graph on a scientist's monitor. One can picture them in the 1930s, with stacks of carbon paper and lamps burning low, writing phrases that would decades later flicker to life on a seismic graph. It was a rhythm of pencil on paper and the faint hum of a typewriter return bar. It was layers of human persistence recording what they could not yet prove. Still, the boundary between coincidence and revelation remains unsteady. Critics counter that a psychic recording vague coordinates near a famous site is bound to overlap with someone's future dig. They say it is probability, not prophecy. Yet numbers alone do not dissolve the fascination. People sense something deliberate in how time folds these parallels together. A reading in Virginia becomes an echo in limestone. A location whispered in a trance becomes a blip on a computer screen. By 1993, an NBC documentary titled The Mystery of the Sphinx carried these findings to millions of viewers. The narration blended geological observations with mythic overtones, weaving the predictions of the prophet into the scientific story. The public was left contemplating whether this marriage of faith and frequency hinted at a hidden truth or merely clever television. But for those steeped in the lore, it felt like vindication. The whole of records represents more than just buried architecture. It is a wish that humanity once possessed a unified knowledge of nature and spirit, and then lost it through pride. Its power lies in the idea that a physical discovery could erase a spiritual amnesia. The vault under the Sphinx, whether real or imagined, turns that yearning into geography. To uncover it would mean more than finding artifacts. It would mean confronting the possibility that history moves in cycles rather than straight lines. Skeptics warn against reading too much into these alignments. They remind us that seismic readings detect shapes, not intentions. Fissures can resemble corridors and cavities can mimic chambers, but such caution rarely quiets the hunger for wonder. Where the data leaves a blank space, the imagination eagerly writes. As long as the authorities restrict deeper excavation under the monument, each unanswered question takes on the shimmer of a guarded truth. The mix of limitation and curiosity has kept the story balanced on a knife edge. For every academic paper closing the case, another fringe article reopens it. Even now, the coordinates traced in the 1930s overlap neatly with the published maps from the 1990s. It is a measured congruence that neither side has fully explained away. The handwriting from the past and the graph from the present sit decades apart, yet they harmonize on paper as if they were collaborating unknowingly across time. Perhaps that is why the idea endures. It is not because the evidence has confirmed it, but because it haunts a perfect midpoint between what we can measure and what we long to believe. Whether Casey channeled an unseen memory or a pure accident, his chosen spot beneath the right forepaw continues to resist dismissal. Even the endless wind of the desert, sweeping sand into the same cracks for centuries, has not erased this outline from the human imagination. The story of the prophet and his coordinates reveals something deep about the texture of faith. People need the hidden to be just plausible enough to chase. Sometimes, the harder we measure, the more those myths hum back with something like a pulse. Beneath that pulse lies a suggestion that stone still keeps secrets of time itself. The coordinates overlap exactly. The echo may mean nothing, or it may mean that myth has patiently left a shadow where reason would one day look. Now, we must turn our attention to the stones themselves and the strange marks of water that suggest a history far older than the desert. In the humid quiet of a Cairo morning, a group of researchers stood near the massive pools of the Sphinx, holding instruments that promised to see through time. They were not looking for pottery or gold. They were looking for geometry. Thomas de Becky, a geophysicist, had brought equipment designed to pulse sound into the earth and listen for the way it bounced back. He was used to mapping oil fields and mineral deposits, places where the earth followed the predictable chaos of nature. But beneath the right forepaw of the Sphinx, the earth did something else. It stopped being chaotic and started being symmetrical. The sound waves hit something flat, something hollow, something rectangular. To a man of science, a rectangle in the bedrock is not a geological feature. It is a signature. It is the footprint of an architect. The data recorded during those surveys in the early 1990s suggested a chamber roughly 9 meters below the surface, positioned with such intent that it seemed to be waiting for a knock on the door. But it was not just a shape that unsettled the team. It was the fact that 60 years before these sensors were even invented, a man in Virginia had already drawn a map of this exact void. His name was Edgar Casey, a soft-spoken man who entered deep trances to speak of things he could not have known while awake. He did not call himself a historian or an archaeologist. He was known as the sleeping prophet, and among his thousands of recorded readings, one prophecy returned with haunting frequency. He claimed that a secret chamber existed beneath the right paw of the Sphinx, a vault he called the Hall of Records. According to Casey, this was not a tomb for a king, but a library for a civilization. He spoke of Atlantis, a world lost to a great flood, whose survivors traveled to the Nile to bury the sum of their knowledge. He said the chamber contained the history of the world from its true beginning, stored on materials that would not decay, waiting for a time when humanity was ready to understand its own origin. For decades, Mainstream scholars dismiss his words as mystical fantasy. But when DeBecky and his colleague Robert Schoch watched their seismic equipment trace a rectangular anomaly exactly where Casey had pointed, the border between myth and measurement began to dissolve. The instruments did not just find one void. They suggested a series of anomalies that seemed to form a network, a subterranean anatomy that the desert had kept hidden for millennia. For those who believe in the mechanical or the intentional, these readings are the first clear evidence that the Sphinx is not a solid block of stone, but a lid on a container. If these chambers truly exist, they challenge every timeline we are being taught in school. The standard history tells us the Sphinx was carved around 2,500 years before the Common Era by the pharaoh Khafre. But if there's a library beneath its pores containing records of a civilization lost 10,000 years ago, then the Sphinx is not a monument to an Egyptian king. It is a guardian of a much older memory. It suggests that the history of human progress is not a straight line upward, but a cycle of great heights and devastating falls. The controversy deepened when the scientific community tried to follow the thread. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Yale University, looked at the limestone walls surrounding the Sphinx and saw something that the archaeologists had missed. He saw water, not the marks of wind-blown sand, which leave sharp, horizontal scars, but the deep, vertical undulations caused by thousands of years of heavy, cascading rain. The problem is that the Giza Plateau has been a desert for at least 5,000 years. For the Sphinx to show signs of heavy rainfall erosion, it would have to be much older than the pyramids. It would have to have stood under the open sky when the Sahara was still green, perhaps as far back as 10,000 BC. This timeline matches the very dates Edgar Cayce provided for the burial of the whole of records. It was as if the stones were speaking the same language as the prophet, and the message they carried was that we are a species with amnesia. But as the evidence of these hollow spaces grew, so did the resistance. The Egyptian authorities, led for years by the powerful Zahi Hawass, had been famously protective of the Sphinx. Permissions for deep drilling or advanced scanning were often restricted or denied. When the 1991 seismic data was presented to the public, it caused a global sensation, but it also triggered a bureaucratic shutdown. To admit that there's a man-made chamber beneath the Sphinx would be to admit that we do not know the true story of human civilization. It would mean that the most famous monument on Earth was built by a people we have no record of, using a technology we have yet to discover. For many officials, this was a risk to national pride and academic stability that they were not willing to take. The files were filed away, and the rectangular voids beneath the pores remained officially classified as natural fissures in the rock. Yet, the questions did not stop. If these are just natural cracks, why are they so perfectly geometric? Why do they align with the cardinal directions? Why do they match the descriptions of a man who claimed to see them in a dream 60 years before technology could prove they existed? For those who suspect something mechanical or artificial lies below, the secrecy only confirms the suspicion. They point to accounts from the 19th century where early explorers described tunnels and shafts that were later filled with sand or blocked by modern masonry. They talk of a secret entrance behind the ear of the Sphinx, or a shaft in its back that leads deep into the bedrock. These stories suggest that the Sphinx is not just a statue, but a machine for memory, a physical archive designed to survive the end of the world. One can picture the scene thousands of years ago, a group of survivors watching the water recede and realizing that their world was gone. They had to leave a signal, something so massive it could not be moved, and so enigmatic it would never be forgotten. They carved a lion, the king of the beasts, towards the rising sun, and beneath its heart they placed the secrets of their science. If the whole of records is real, It might not contain scrolls of papyrus or clay tablets. It might contain something far more advanced. Some theorists suggest the records are stored on crystals or metallic plates that use light and frequency to store vast amounts of data. This would explain why Casey called it a hall of records rather than a library. It implies a different kind of storage, one that a primitive culture would find as miraculous as magic. The global context only adds to the mystery. Across the world, from the jungles of Cambodia to the high mountains of Peru, we find similar guardians. We find massive stone lions and feline beings standing over the entrances to subterranean temples. We find legends of hidden archives and secret knowledge guarded by silent sentinels. Is it possible that the Sphinx is part of a global network? A network of memory banks left by a precursor civilization that knew its time was ending? If we could peer into the hollow spaces beneath the Sphinx, we might find that the history of Egypt is just a final chapter of a much longer story. A story that links the pyramids to the stars and the desert to the bottom of the sea. Despite the official denials, the echoes from the hollow continue to vibrate through the scientific community. New technologies, such as muon tomography, which uses cosmic rays to see through solid stone, are currently being used on the Great Pyramid. These pulses have already revealed a massive, hidden void above the Grand Gallery, a discovery that stunned the world only a few years ago. The same technology could be used to finally settle the debate about the Sphinx. It could tell us once and for all if the rectangles found in 1991 are rooms or rocks. But so far, the sensors have not been allowed to rest on the limestone base of the lion. The mystery remains sealed, protected by layers of bureaucracy as thick as the sand that once buried the monument to its neck. A quiet man in a modest house in Virginia Beach closed his eyes, fell into a deep trance, and began speaking about a chamber lost beneath the desert. His voice, recorded by stenographers who worked by the soft glow of lamplight, described a vault positioned specifically below the right forepaw of the Sphinx, built long before Egypt's dynasties began. He gave coordinates specific enough to be mapped decades before technology could peer beneath that massive stone body. To those sitting in that small room, it sounded like an echo from another age. One part prophecy, one part blueprint. The man was Edgar Casey, known by his followers as the sleeping prophet. He never claimed to be awake when his revelations arrived. Instead, he drifted into altered states, half sleeping and half speaking, while his words spilled through him like dictation from somewhere beyond his own memory. He would talk of lost continents, of floods and migrations, and of civilizations that once could harness energies forgotten by modern science. But among all the predictions that passed through him, one kept returning with unnerving precision. Beneath the right paw of the Sphinx, he said, lies a hall of records containing the story of humanity's true beginning, traced back to the people of Atlantis. Night after night, his assistant sat at small desks, converting his murmured syllables into careful handwriting. Each reading carried fragments of the same geography, mentioning angles, coordinates, and the existence of entrances guarded by silence and sand. One stenographer later described how her hands trembled as she wrote, not from a personal belief in the supernatural, but from the eerie certainty in the tone of the man. He spoke like someone who had been there before. On a map tacked above the desk, they drew the outline of the Sphinx and shaded the ground between its paws, labeling it simply with a large question mark. For the followers of the prophet, the Hall of Records was no mere tomb or burial site. It was an archive of memory, documenting an epoch when knowledge and myth were not yet separate. He claimed that after the fall of Atlantis around 12,000 years ago, its survivors established colonies where the Nile meets the desert, rebuilding fragments of their lost science. The massive lion-headed sentinel was, in his account, the threshold to their subterranean library, sealed until humanity was ready once again to use its wisdom. Critics during his lifetime dismissed these readings as mystical invention. A psychic predicting coordinates beneath one of the most studied monuments on Earth sounded like folklore with footnotes. Archaeologists regarded his claims as fringe spirituality wrapped in pseudo-geography. Yet among his archivists, small curiosities persisted. Why the Sphinx? Why that exact spot? And how had a man with no formal training in geology or Egyptian history pinpointed a location that would decades later draw the attention of scientists armed with seismic equipment? By the mid-20th century, the archive of his readings, thousands of pages stored by the Association for Research and Enlightenment, became both a curiosity and a seed for future expeditions. The prophet himself had said the chamber would be found in the 1990s, a detail that would aid from prophecy to coincidence soon enough. When those years finally arrived, researchers did indeed sweep ground sensors beneath the right pole, chasing anomalies that rose from below the sand like faint, rhythmic heartbeats. In 1991, the desert shook softly with soundless pulses. A team of scientists aimed seismic sensors at the base of the Great Sphinx and detected something that should not exist. Rectangular voids beneath its pores, perfectly aligned, as if carved with intent. The readings came back symmetrical, geometric, and deep. The data stunned them. Beneath one of the most studied monuments on Earth, buried under solid limestone, the instruments whispered of hollow spaces shaped like perfect chambers. The lead geophysicist, Thomas DeBecke, directed low-frequency waves through the limestone base to read density changes underground. What bounced back were clear geometric patterns. Their findings, presented publicly, noted shapes too regular to be simple cracks or natural fissures. DeBecke admitted surprise at how symmetrical the anomaly seemed. Such details sounded exactly like the outlines described 6 decades earlier. For skeptics, it was a coincidence. For others, it was the first crack in the official story of human history itself. The reaction from mainstream Egyptology was swift and ranged from irritation to total unease. Zahi Hawass, who oversaw many excavations around the plateau, openly dismissed talk of secret vaults as Western fantasy. He argued that the anomalies could be natural fissures from ancient seismic activity, a mundane explanation shaped like a mystery. Still, reports claim he authorized brief follow-up investigations, possibly to satisfy curiosity or perhaps to keep control over what narrative might form if outsiders continue their search unchecked. The results of those deeper studies were never fully released, ensuring that theories only multiplied in the gaps where information thinned. For the community following the prophet, however, the overlap was breathtaking. On the very spot where he had placed his Hall of Records, modern sensors located a void roughly 25 feet beneath the surface. Whether it was a chamber, a fissure, or a cosmic coincidence, it was enough to reignite the century-old question. Could knowledge survive in stone, waiting for its rediscovery? Supporters suggested that the Sphinx might guard a message written not in ink, but in architecture. The Hall of Records, as it was described, contained scrolls chronicling the history of a lost world, its technologies, and the migrations that seeded later cultures. The prophet envisioned humans once capable of channeling forces between the physical and the spiritual, bridging energy in ways forgotten after a great catastrophe. Many of his words felt half metaphor and half memory, a record of that which makes one whole again. Beneath such phrasing lay a theme that appealed deeply to those alive during turbulent decades. The dream that humanity had once been wiser and more connected, and might one day reunite with that source of understanding. For the academic community of Egypt, The claim threatened decades of careful chronology. The Fourth Dynasty timeline placed the Sphinx firmly within the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, about 2,500 years before the Common Era. To admit any significant anomaly, even by geological happenstance, invited endless public speculation. Inside the headquarters of the association, archivists watched this unfold with quiet satisfaction. Some had once transcribed the coordinates themselves by hand. The handwriting on those yellowing pages recorded latitude and placement as if they were mundane facts, never imagining they might later mirror the notation of a scientist. One can picture them in the 1940s, stacks of carbon paper and lamps burning low, writing phrases that would decades later flicker to life on a seismic graph. The rhythm of pencil on paper and the faint hum of the typewriter return bar were layers of human persistence recording what they could not prove. Still, the boundary between coincidence and revelation remains unsteady. Critics counter that a psychic recording vague coordinates near one of the most excavated sites in history is bound to overlap with a future dig. Probability, not prophecy, explains a pattern. Yet numbers alone do not dissolve fascination. People sense something deliberate in how time folds these parallels together. A reading in Virginia becomes an echo in limestone. A location once whispered in a trance becomes a blip on a monitor. By 1993, a documentary titled The Mystery of the Sphinx carried these findings to public. The narration blended geological observations with mythic overtones, freely weaving predictions into the scientific storyline. Viewers were left contemplating whether this marriage of faith and frequency hinted at a hidden truth or clever television. But for those already steeped in the lore, it felt like vindication, a signal rising where words once lay dormant. The whole of records represents more than buried architecture. It is a wish that humanity once possessed unified knowledge of nature, energy, and spirit, and then lost it through pride or catastrophe. Its symbolic power lies in the idea that physical discovery could erase spiritual amnesia. The vault under the Sphinx, whether real or imagined, turns that yearning into geography. To uncover it would mean more than finding artifacts. It would mean confronting the possibility that history moves in cycles rather than straight lines. Skeptics warn against reading too much into these alignments. Seismic readings detect shapes, but they do not detect intention. Fissures can resemble corridors, and cavities can mimic chambers, but such caution rarely quiets the public hunger for wonder. Where data leaves blanks, imagination eagerly writes. And as long as the Egyptian government restricts deeper excavation under the monument, each unanswered question takes on the shimmer of guarded truth. The mix of limitation and curiosity has kept the story balanced on a knife edge. Even now, the coordinates traced by the stenographers overlap neatly with the published maps from the 1990 surveys. It is a measured congruence that neither side has fully explained away. The handwriting from the 1930s and the graph from the 1990s sit decades apart, yet they harmonize on paper as if collaborating unknowingly across time. Perhaps that is why the idea endures, not because evidence has confirmed it, but because it haunts a perfect midpoint between what we can measure and what we long to believe. Whether the prophet channeled unseen memory, subconscious pattern recognition, or pure accident, his chosen spot beneath the right paw continues to resist dismissal. Even the endless wind sweeping sand into the same cracks for centuries has not erased its outline from the human imagination. The story of the coordinates reveals less about supernatural knowledge and more about the texture of faith. People need the hidden to be just plausible enough to chase. And sometimes, the harder we measure, the more those myths hum back with something like a pulse. Beneath that pulse lies a suggestion that stone still keeps secrets, not just of geology, but of time itself. As the years passed, the idea of these ancient tunnels began to converge with developing science. The same coordinates once mapped by torchlight would later be revisited by technologists armed with seismic probes. Their instruments spoke in pulses instead of echoes, but the curiosity was identical. Each reading sought to replace rumor with resonance, to find in numbers what explorers once sought in shadow. It was a continuation rather than a correction, one story layering quietly over another in the same sand. When the 20th century finally brought machines capable of looking below without digging, the myth gained a new kind of audience. People began comparing those early sketches to modern data, noting coincidences between the suspected hollows and later anomalies. Whether meaningful or not, the overlap gave weight to whispers once dismissed. In this sense, the early adventurers did more than speculate. They charted a direction for inquiry long before the technology existed to confirm or deny it. Their maps became the rough outlines of a prophecy waiting for proof. The explorers of the past did not know that a century later researchers with ground-penetrating devices would target nearly the same points and find, to their surprise, readings that refused to behave like solid stone. Even now, scholars debate whether those old accounts were accidents of erosion or intuition sharpened by chance. But something lingers in the record, the impression that both myth and measurement trace the same hidden root. The Sphinx, patient as ever, offers no clarification. Its paws rest on the same ground those wanderers once tore into, and the sealed spaces, if they exist, have kept their appointment with secrecy. Yet there is a symmetry in that. The earliest glimpses through the sand and the echo beneath the feet of a worker were the beginning of a map written in story. That map, drawn by hand and revised in dreams, would later align with readings from machines that never touched the stone. Through coincidence or design, the coordinates matched. And so, the myth of the hidden chambers did not vanish. It prepared the way for science to rediscover wonder. The old torchlight had already marked where the seismograph would one day listen. The data remains, boxed and labeled, an archive that few are permitted to enter. The rectangular voids under the pores have not been excavated, and the official maps still show only the solid bedrock of the Giza Plateau. But the memory of those pulses, recorded in 1991, continues to vibrate in the minds of those who seek the truth. They represent a boundary where the physical world meets the metaphysical. The silence from the authorities only deepens a conviction that something significant lies just out of reach. If the geometry is as perfect as the senses suggested, then the limestone is not merely a foundation, but a container. It is a vessel holding the echoes of a time we have forgotten, a time the prophet spoke of while he slept. The story of the whole of records is not over. It is waiting for the next pulse of sound, the next shift in the sand, and the moment when the gatekeepers finally step aside to let the light in. Until then, the Sphinx remains a guardian of both stone and secret, watching the horizon for a sunrise that will finally reveal what lies beneath. In 1991, the desert air over the Giza Plateau did not just carry heat. It carried a pulse. A team of researchers, led by geophysicist Thomas DeBecke and geologist Robert Schoch, aimed seismic sensors at the base of the Great Sphinx and detected something that should not exist. Rectangular voids beneath its pores, perfectly aligned, as if carved with intent. The readings came back symmetrical, geometric, and deep. The data stunned them. Beneath one of the most studied monuments on Earth, buried under solid limestone, the instruments whispered of hollow spaces shaped like perfect chambers. But the strangest part was not the discovery itself. It was that someone had already described it 6 decades earlier. His name was Edgar Cayce. He claimed a hidden chamber slept below the Sphinx, guarding the memory of a world that vanished beneath the sea. He called it the Hole of Records, a vault built by those who survived the Great Flood so to contain the story of humanity's true beginnings. When scientists saw their sensors pulse over the same coordinates he had drawn from a trance 60 years earlier, myth and measurement collided for the first time. For skeptics, it was a coincidence. For others, it was the first crack in the story of human history itself. In the early 1930s, a quiet man in a modest house in Virginia closed his eyes, fell into a trance, and began speaking about a chamber lost beneath the Sphinx. His voice, recorded by typists who worked by lamplight, described a vault position below its forepaw, built long before Egypt's dynasties. He gave coordinates specific enough to be mapped decades before technology could peer beneath that stone body. To those around him, it sounded like an echo from another age. One part prophecy, one part blueprint. The man was Edgar Cayce, known by his followers as the sleeping prophet. He never claimed to be awake when his revelations arrived. Instead, he drifted into altered states, half sleeping, half speaking, while his words spilled through him like dictation from somewhere beyond his own memory. He would talk of lost continents, of floods and migrations, of civilizations that once could harness energies forgotten by modern science. But among all the predictions that passed through him, one kept returning with precision. Beneath the Sphinx's right paw, he said, lies a hole of records containing the story of humanity's true beginning, traced back to the people of Atlantis. Night after night, his assistant sat at small desks, converting his murmured syllables into careful handwriting. Each reading carried fragments of the same geography, coordinates, angles, the mention of entrances guarded by silence and sand. One stenographer later described how her hands trembled as she wrote, not from belief, but from the eerie certainty in the tone of Cayce. The man spoke like someone who had been there before. On a map tacked above the desk, they drew the outline of the Sphinx and shaded the ground between its paws, labeling it simply with a question mark. For the followers of Cayce, the Hole of Records was no mere tomb. It was an archive of memory, documenting an epoch when knowledge and myth were not separate. He claimed that after the fall of Atlantis around 12,000 years ago, its survivors established colonies where the Nile meets the desert, rebuilding fragments of their lost science. The massive lion-headed sentinel in his account marked the threshold to their subterranean library, sealed until humanity was ready once again to use its wisdom. His words carried an odd mixture of fatalism and optimism. He seemed certain that the rediscovery of these records would signal both remembrance and reckoning. Critics, even in his lifetime, dismissed these readings as mystical invention. A psychic predicting coordinates beneath one of the world's most studied monuments sounded like folklore with footnotes. Archaeologists regarded his claims as fringe spirituality wrapped in pseudo-geography. Yet among his stenographers and archivists, small curiosities persisted. Why the Sphinx? Why that exact spot? And how had a man with no formal training in geology or Egyptian history pinpointed a location that would decades later draw the attention of scientists armed with seismic equipment? By the mid-20th century, the archive of his readings, thousands of pages stored by the Association for Research and Enlightenment, became both a curiosity and a seed for future expeditions. Cayce himself had said the chamber would be found in the 1990s, a detail that would aid from prophecy to coincidence soon enough. When those years arrived, researchers did indeed sweep ground sensors beneath the forepaw of the Sphinx, chasing anomalies that rose from below the sand like faint heartbeats. Most regarded it as a fascinating alignment of storytelling and science, an old prophecy meeting the hum of a modern instrument. Inside the small office of Casey, the late-night rituals continued even after his death in 1945. Assistants turned their predictions into index cards stored alphabetically. Atlantis, Egypt, prophesies, Sphinx. They annotated weathered anecdotes about world floods, keeping one eye on his more specific data descriptions. During those years, popular fascination with lost civilizations grew rapidly. Articles about Babylonia, Lemuria, and pyramid power exploded across radio and magazines, blending new technology with ancient wonder. The Sphinx, motionless but ever watchful, became the quiet icon of that movement. The description Casey offered of its age clashed directly with accepted Egyptology. He dated it to around 10,000 before Christ, an era archaeologists saw as prehistory, long before organized states or formal irrigation. To professionals, the claim broke both timelines and patience. Yet, in his readings, he insisted the monument was older than the pyramids by thousands of years. It was built, he said, by exiles from Atlantis who wanted to leave a signal for those who would forget. That phrasing caught the imagination of the people because it sounded less like grand myth and more like instruction, a relic meant to be activated one day rather than merely admired. By the time seismic teams took interest in the early 1990s, that instruction seemed to echo in unexpected places. Geophysicist Thomas DeBecke, working with geologist Robert Schoch, directed low-frequency waves through the limestone base of the Sphinx to read density changes underground. What bounced back were clear geometric patterns, rectangular cavities beneath the forepaw. Their findings, presented publicly in 1991, noted shapes too regular to be simple cracks or voids. Though careful with language, DeBecke admitted surprise at how symmetrical the anomaly seemed. Such details sounded faintly like the outlines Casey had spoken of 6 decades earlier. The foundation of Casey and Virginia Beach had supported parts of that research financially. For critics, it blurred uncomfortable borders, science entangled with faith. How objective could data be when funded by those inviting its prophecy to prove itself? Yet others saw the partnership as poetic symmetry, like two worlds meeting halfway, one sending vibrations through stone, the other through trance. Among mainstream Egyptologists, reaction ranged from irritation to unease. Zahi Hawass, who oversaw many excavations around the Sphinx, openly dismissed talk of secret vaults as Western fantasy. He argued that the anomalies could be natural fissures from ancient seismic activity, a mundane explanation shaped like a mystery. Still, some reports claim he authorized brief follow-up investigations, possibly to satisfy curiosity, possibly to keep control over what narrative might form if outsiders continued their search unchecked. The results of those deeper studies were never fully released, ensuring that theories only multiplied in the gaps where information thinned. For the community of Casey, though, the overlap was breathtaking. On the very spot where he had placed his haul of records, the right forepaw, modern sensors located a void roughly 25 feet beneath the surface. Whether chamber, fissure, or coincidence, it was enough to reignite the century-old question: could knowledge survive in stone, waiting for its rediscovery? Supporters suggested that the Sphinx might guard a message written not in ink, but in architecture. The whole of records, as Casey described it, contained scrolls chronicling the history of Atlantis, its technologies, and the migrations that seeded later cultures. He envisioned humans once capable of channeling forces between the physical and the spiritual, bridging energy in ways forgotten after catastrophe. Many of his words felt half metaphor, half memory, a record of that which makes one whole again. Beneath such phrasing lay a theme that appealed deeply to those alive during turbulent decades. The dream that humanity had once been wiser, more connected, and might one day reunite with that source of understanding. For the academic community of Egypt, the claim threatened decades of careful chronology. The Fourth Dynasty timeline placed the Sphinx firmly within the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, about 2500 before Christ. Every temple alignment, every quarry mark supported that range. To admit any significant anomaly, even by geological happenstance, invited endless public speculation. In cafes from Cairo to London, these small details metastasized into larger debates. Could the most famous statue of the world sit atop something older than its own civilization? The question refused to stay confined within scientific journals. It leapt to documentaries, talk shows, and late-night radio. Inside the headquarters of the archivists, they watched this unfold with quiet satisfaction. Some had once transcribed the coordinates themselves. The handwriting on those yellowing pages recorded latitude and placement as if they were mundane facts, never imagining they might later mirror the notation of scientists. Still, the boundary between coincidence and revelation remains unsteady. Critics counter that a psychic recording vague coordinates near one of the most excavated sites of history is bound to overlap with a future dig of someone. Probability, not prophecy, they say, explains a pattern. Yet, as with so many ancient enigmas, numbers alone do not dissolve fascination. People sense something deliberate in how time folds these parallels together. A reading in Virginia becomes an echo in limestone. A location once whispered in trance becomes a blip on a monitor. In 1993, a documentary titled The Mystery of the Sphinx carried these findings to public. Narration blended geological observations with mythic overtones, freely weaving predictions of Casey into the scientific storyline. Viewers were left contemplating whether this marriage of faith and frequency hinted at hidden truth or clever television. But for those already steeped in the lore of the sleeping prophet, it felt like vindication, a signal rising where words once lay dormant. The whole of records in mythic terms represents more than buried architecture. It is a wish that humanity once possessed unified knowledge of nature, energy, and spirit, and then lost it through pride or catastrophe. Its symbolic power lies in the idea that physical discovery could erase spiritual amnesia. The vault under the Sphinx, whether real or imagined, turns that yearning into geography. To uncover it would mean more than finding artifacts. It would mean confronting the possibility that history moves in cycles, not straight lines. Skeptics, however, warn against reading too much into these alignments. Seismic readings detect shapes, not intention. Fissures can resemble corridors. Cavities can mimic chambers. But such caution rarely quiets the hunger of the public for wonder. Where data leaves blanks, imagination eagerly writes. And as long as the Egyptian government restricts deeper excavation under the monument, each unanswered question takes on the shimmer of guarded truth. The mix of limitation and curiosity has kept the story balanced on a knife edge. For every academic paper closing the case, another fringe article reopens it. Even now, the coordinates traced by the stenographers overlap neatly with the published maps from the surveys of the 1990s. It is a measured congruence that neither side has fully explained away. The handwriting from the 1930s and the graph from the 1990s sit decades apart yet harmonize on paper as if collaborating unknowingly across time. Perhaps that is why the idea endures, not because evidence has confirmed it, but because it haunts a perfect midpoint between what we can measure and what we long to believe. Whether Casey channeled unseen memory, subconscious pattern recognition, or pure accident, his chosen spot beneath the right forepaw continues to resist dismissal. Even the endless wind of Egypt sweeping sand into the same crack for centuries has not erased its outline from the human imagination. The story of the prophet and his coordinates reveals less about supernatural knowledge and more about the texture of faith. It shows people needing the hidden to be just plausible enough to chase. And sometimes the harder we measure, the more those myths hum back with something like a pulse. Beneath that pulse lies a suggestion that stone still keeps secrets, not just of geology, but of time itself. The coordinates overlap exactly. The echo between them may mean nothing, or it may mean that myth has patiently left a shadow where reason one day would look. If the whole of records is real, perhaps we have been looking for the wrong kind of archive. We imagine shells, scrolls, and stone tablets. We look for a library where a person might walk between rows of forgotten books, brushing dust from parchment. But what if the secret beneath the Sphinx is not a room for people, but a housing for a machine, a device of stone and gravity designed to function across tens of thousands of years? The idea sounds like science fiction until you consider the physical evidence of what the ancients were truly capable of creating. The desert does not just bury. It preserves through weight and silence, waiting for a specific moment in time to reveal its inner workings. In 1901, a group of sponge divers off the coast of a small Greek island pulled a calcified lump from a Roman shipwreck. It looked like a rock. It felt like a stone, but inside, beneath centuries of corrosion, lay the impossible: bronze gears, interlocking cogwheels, and a complex differential that tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets with precision that should not have existed for another 1,000 years. It was the Antikythera mechanism, a computer built before the height of the Roman Empire. It taught us a humbling lesson. The ancient world possessed a mastery of mechanics that we had written out of history. Now, shift your gaze back to the Giza Plateau. If a handheld device could track the heavens, what might a monument the size of a mountain be capable of if its stone body was more than just a statue? Consider the rectangular voids detected beneath the Sphinx's paws. To a geologist, they are cavities. To a mystic, they are chambers. But to an engineer, they resemble something else entirely. Housings, sockets, the empty spaces left behind when a massive internal component is removed or remains waiting to be engaged. Some researchers suggest that the Sphinx is not a tomb, but a lithic machine. They propose that the tunnels and shafts spidering beneath the plateau are not for people, but for the movement of sand, water, and weight. A pneumatic or hydraulic system where the seasonal rise and fall of the Nile acts as a slow, rhythmic power source. A clock that ticks once every century, moving a gear of limestone so massive it requires a way to the desert to turn. The Greeks spoke of Heron of Alexandria, a man who built automated doors that opened when a temple fire was lit, and statues that hissed steam or poured wine through hidden siphons. His work was proof that the ancient world understood the marriage of architecture and automation. If such knowledge existed in the late Ptolemaic period, could it have been a lingering shadow of something much older? A legacy from the same builders who aligned the Great Pyramid to the stars with a tolerance of less than a fraction of a degree. On a map of the Sphinx's subterranean anomalies, the lines are too straight. The corners are too sharp. They suggest a framework built to support movement. A series of counterweights hidden in the deep limestone that might only respond to a specific resonance or precise astronomical alignment. Imagine the moment of activation. It would not be a digital beep or a flicker of light. It would be the sound of stone meeting stone, a low, subterranean groan that would vibrate through the soles of your feet long, before you heard it with your ears. The sound of 1,000-ton locks sliding open on a bed of sand and oil. Some theorists believe the trigger is not a key, but the sun itself. On the morning of the vernal equinox, when the sun rises exactly in line with the Sphinx's gaze, the light hits the chest of the monument at a precise angle. It is a clock built to strike once every few thousand years, timed to the great year, the long cycle of the stars that the ancients seemed obsessed with tracking. If the Sphinx is a sentinel, perhaps it is also a timer. The seismic data from 1991 whispered of these shapes. The pulses travel through the rock and bounce back with the outline of something hollow and symmetric. But why would you build a chamber in the shape of a perfect rectangle 30 feet below a lion's pool unless you intended to put something inside it? If you were building a library, you would want stairs and ventilation. But these anomalies seem isolated, sealed within the core of the plateau itself. This has led some to suggest that the Sphinx guard a master clock, a device that synchronizes the various monuments of Giza into a single astronomical instrument, a sentinel that does not just watch the stars, but records their passage through the slow, heavy movement of gears we cannot see. Acoustic archaeology has begun to offer a new way of looking at these stones. We know that the Great Pyramid has resonant properties, that certain chambers amplify sound to a frequency that can affect human consciousness or even structural integrity. If the Sphinx is part of this same network, then the voids beneath its pores might be resonance chambers. They could be designed to vibrate in sympathy with the Earth's own hum, or the sound of the wind crossing the plateau. When the right frequency is reached, perhaps the mechanical seals are triggered. We are looking for a door handle when we should be looking for a song. The ancients did not separate science from spirit, and they did not separate architecture from machine. Critics argue that limestone is too soft and too brittle for complex mechanics. They say that any gear made of stone would grind itself to dust under its own weight. But they forget the power hydraulics in sand. Ancient Egyptian engineers moved obelisks weighing hundreds of tons by using sand as a controlled liquid, allowing the stones to sink slowly and perfectly into place. If you can use sand to lower a monument, you can use it to lift one. The voids beneath the Sphinx could be part of a massive sand valve system, a mechanical lock that can only be opened by those who know how to manipulate the weight of the plateau itself. It is a security system that does not rust and does not require electricity. It only requires time. The legend of the Hole of Records often mentions that the archive will be found when humanity is ready. In a mechanical context, ready might mean when we have regained the knowledge to interface with the machine. We peer into the ground with ground-penetrating radar and seismic sensors, but we are like children looking at a computer screen without a keyboard. We see the shapes of the components, but we do not know how to turn them on. The rectangular voids are the motherboards of a prehistoric technology carved into the bones of the earth. They are the clockwork of the ancients, ticking away in a language of gravity and stone. As the shadow of the equinox nears the center of the Sphinx's chest, the tension between what we know and what we suspect grows tighter. Every year, thousands of people gather to watch the sun rise between the paws of the lion, unaware that they might be standing on top of a dormant engine. The silence of the Sphinx is the silence of a machine that has reached the end of its cycle. It is the quiet of a coiled spring. The anomalies detected by scientists in the 90s remain unexplored, protected by bureaucracy and fear. But stone does not care about permits. It only cares about the alignment. And as the stars move into their predestined positions, the mechanical heart of Giza may be preparing to beat for the first time in 12,000 years. The possibility of a mechanical Sphinx changes the stakes of Egyptian archaeology. It suggests that the monuments are not just dead stone, but active participants in a larger plan. If the Sphinx is a clock, what is it counting down to? Is it the return of the civilization that built it, or is it a warning of a coming change in the Earth's own cycle? We look for answers in the past, but the machine may be pointing toward the future. The coordinates mapped by Edgar Cayce and confirmed by seismic sensors might not lead to a library of books, but to the control room of the plateau, a place where the mechanics of the heavens were translated into the mechanics of the earth. In the archives of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the old stenographer's notes are being digitized. The words of the sleeping prophet are being matched with the graphs of the geophysicists. They are finding that the descriptions of the chamber's depth and placement are consistent with the requirements of a large-scale mechanical housing. The alignment, the symmetry, the depth, it all fits. The desert is a masterpiece of engineering, a clockwork kingdom hidden beneath the grit. And the Sphinx is the key. It is a sentinel at the gate, the watcher of the hours, the lion that guards the gears of time. If we ever find a way to peer inside those rectangular voids without damaging the monument, we might not find gold or jewels. We might find a series of interlocking stone cylinders, polished to a mirror finish. We might find shafts that lead into the deep water table, using the pressure of the earth to maintain a perpetual motion. We might find that the Sphinx is the most complex machine ever built, a device that has survived the rise and fall of every empire in human history. It is a testament to a level of foresight we can barely imagine, a message left in a medium that can endure for eternity. But for now, the gears are still. The voids remain empty on our maps, and the Sphinx continues its long watch. The mystery of what lies beneath is not just a question of history, but a challenge to our understanding of technology. We assume that progress is a straight line, but the clockwork of the ancients suggests that it moves in circles. We are coming back to a point we have reached before, and as we stand on the Giza Plateau, listening for the sound of shifting stone, we are waiting for the machine to tell us who we are. The shadows are lengthening. The alignment is almost perfect. The pulse of the desert is quickening, and the stone sentinel is ready to reveal its clockwork heart. The transition from myth to mechanics is the final crack in the story of human history. It bridges the gap between the sleeping prophet's trance and the scientist's sensor. It turns the Sphinx from a statue into an interface. And as we prepare to look deeper, we must ask ourselves if we are ready for the answer. Because a machine, unlike a book, does not just tell a story. It does work. It changes the world. And if the Sphinx finally begins to turn, the world we know might never be the same again. The echo of the gears is already there, if you know how to listen. It is the sound of the past reaching out to touch the future. And it is the sound of a secret that has finally run out of time. For decades, we have spoken of the Hall of Records as a library, a quiet vault of stone and papyrus where the wisdom of a lost world sits gathering dust. We imagine scholars in linen robes, carefully placing scrolls into granite bins, sealing the doors against the coming of the sand. But what if that vision is too simple? What if the rectangular voids detected beneath the pores of the Sphinx in 1991 were not intended to hold books, but to house a machine? This is the heart of the Giza mechanism theory, a proposition that shifts our focus from the spiritual to the mechanical, suggesting that the Sphinx is not merely a sentinel, but an integral component of a planetary device. If the seismic readings were correct, if those chambers are perfectly symmetrical and deep, we must ask why such precision was necessary. In the world of engineering, symmetry is rarely for decoration. It is for balance. It is for the housing of moving parts. It is for the containment of force. When the seismic sensors first pulsed over the limestone in the early 1990s, they revealed shapes that defied natural explanation. rectangular cavities, roughly 30 feet below the surface, aligned with the cardinal points in the body of the lion itself. To a geologist, these are anomalies. To an engineer, they are casings. Think for a moment about the materials that make up the Giza Plateau. The Sphinx is carved from a single massive ridge of limestone, a sedimentary rock that is rich in calcite. But surrounding it, and often found in the deeper shafts like the Osiris shaft, is granite brought from hundreds of miles away. Granite is high in quartz. Quartz is piezoelectric. When you apply pressure to a quartz crystal, it generates an electrical charge. When you subject it to a specific vibration, it can resonate with terrifying precision. If the Sphinx sits atop a network of chambers carved into the specific geology, it may not be a tomb or a library at all. It may be a resonator. Some theorists suggest that the Giza Plateau functions as a massive harmonic machine, one that utilizes the flow of the Nile and the vibration of the earth to produce a frequency we can no longer hear. In this model, the Sphinx is a regulator, the tuning fork that kept the system in balance. If you find yourself pulled towards these stories of forgotten technology and the idea that our ancestors mastered forces we are only beginning to understand, please consider subscribing. And if you like the idea of history being more than just a timeline of kings and wars, a press on the like button or a friendly comment helps us keep these explorations moving forward. Now, let's look closer at the blueprint of this suspected machine. In the early 1930s, Edgar Cayce spoke of the Hall of Records, but he also spoke of the use of energy that came from the sun and the stars, harnessed through crystals and stones. At the time, his followers thought he was speaking in metaphors. But as we peer beneath the sand with ground-penetrating radar, the metaphor starts to look like a schematic. The rectangular voids under the right forepaw are positioned exactly where an engineer might place a control room or primary switch. If the Sphinx was built around 10,000 BC, during an era of massive climatic shifts and solar instability, a mechanism to track and perhaps mitigate the effects of the Earth precession would be more valuable than any book. It would be a survival tool. This leads us to the idea of the Sphinx as a precessional clock. The Earth wobbles on its axis in a cycle that takes roughly 26,000 years to complete. This is the Great Year, the slow turning of the zodiacal ages. The Sphinx, as a lion, faces a rising sun. Around 10,500 BC, it would have faced the constellation of Leo, its celestial counterpart. If there is a mechanism beneath it, that mechanism might be geared to this cycle. Some researchers propose that the chambers do not contain scrolls, but a physical representation of this clock, perhaps a device that tracks the shifting of the poles or the resonance of the planetary core. It is a staggering thought that beneath one of the most visited tourist sites on the planet, a massive, ancient computer may be silently keeping time, waiting for the cycle to return to its starting point. Critics will say that the ancient Egyptians of the 4th dynasty had no knowledge of gears or complex machinery. They are right, but that is exactly why the Giza mechanism theory is so disruptive. It suggests that the Sphinx was already there, a relic of a far older, more advanced civilization that the dynastic Egyptians found and restored. They saw a god, but they were looking at a machine they no longer knew how to turn on. They built their temples around it. They carved their pharaohs' faces onto it, and they protected it. But the secret of its function was lost to them as surely as it is lost to us. When we see the seismic returns, we see the empty spaces where the components once sat today. Or perhaps the components are still there, encased in stone that we are forbidden to break. Consider the layout of the plateau once more. The pyramids, the causeways, the Sphinx, and the temples. They are connected by a network of tunnels and shafts that defies simple explanation as burial sites. Many are empty. Many lead to dead ends. Many are flooded with groundwater that has a specific mineral content. If you were designing a power plant or a massive acoustic resonator, you would need exactly this. Channel for water to provide pressure, chambers to create resonance, and a massive stone sentinel to act as a grounding point for the entire system. The Giza mechanism theory posits that the Sphinx is the capstone of this subterranean engine. The voids beneath the pores are not empty by accident. They are the empty sockets of a technology that was either removed long ago or remains sealed behind walls of limestone that are too thick for our senses to penetrate. By the mid-1990s, the official story of the Sphinx became one of silence. After the initial excitement of the seismic findings, the permissions for deeper scans were revoked. The Egyptian government, under the direction of Zahi Hawass, maintained that nothing was there. But why the secrecy? If the scans showed nothing but solid rock, there would be no reason to stop the research. Instead, the data was categorized and the tunnels were closed. This has led many to believe that what was found was not just a room, but something that challenged the very foundation of human history. If a mechanical device, or even the clear evidence of a housing for one, was discovered, it would mean that we are not the first civilization to master the earth. It would mean that we are living in the shadow of a giant we do not understand. The rhythm of the search for this mechanism is a slow one. It moves through the decades and pulses, just like the seismic waves. In the 1930s, it was a psychic trance. In the 1990s, it was a low-frequency transducer. In the 2020s, it is a study of muon tomography and cosmic rays. Each time we look, the shapes remain, rectangular, geometric, and perfectly aligned. The stone does not change, only our ability to read it. The Giza mechanism theory suggests that we are looking for a library because that is what we know how to value. We are a culture of information, but the builders might have been a culture of energy. To them, a hall of records might have been a hall of power, a place where the frequency of the planet was tuned to match the frequency of the stars. Think of the silence that surrounds the Sphinx today. It is a heavy silence, guarded by the military and by a wall of bureaucracy. But beneath that silence, there is a hum. Not a literal sound, perhaps, but a resonance of possibility. If the Sphinx is a machine, its purpose may be to act as a beacon, a signal that survives the rise and fall of oceans and the shifting of the sands. If something mechanical lies beneath the pores, it is the most important artifact in human history. It is the proof that we have been here before, and that we knew how to speak to the earth in its own language. The seismic data from 1991 did not just find a hollow space. It found a question that we are not yet allowed to answer. As we move forward, the technology to see through stone will only improve. We will develop sensors that can map every grain of quartz and every pocket of air. And when that day comes, the Giza mechanism theory will face its final test. We will finally see if the rectangular voids are empty or if they contain the remnants of a lost science. Until then, the Sphinx remains a guardian of a different kind. It guards our wonder. It guards our suspicion that the world is much older and much stranger than the textbooks say. The echo of the 1991 census still hangs in the air, a reminder that under the solid limestone, the instruments whispered of something that should not exist. And in that whisper, we find the motivation to keep looking, to keep questioning, and to keep listening to the pulse of the stone. Whether it is a library of scrolls or a hall of gears, the space beneath the Sphinx represents the ultimate threshold. It is the boundary between what we know and what we have forgotten, The Giza mechanism theory invites us to look at the plateau not as a graveyard, but as a silent laboratory, a place where the laws of physics and the dreams of the ancients met in a marriage of stone and symmetry. The secret may not be written in ink, but in the very frequency of the bedrock. And as the sun rises over the lion's head, we are reminded that some machines do not need electricity to run. They only need time. And time is the one thing the Sphinx has in abundance. The mystery is not just what lies beneath, but why we are so determined to find it. Perhaps it is because we know, deep down, that the secret beneath the pores is a key to our own future. The secret of a mechanism that was built to outlast the world and to remind us who we truly are. The data remains. The voids are still there, and the Sphinx is still watching. We are only waiting for the moment when the gears of history finally turn enough to let us in. In 1991, the desert shook softly with soundless pulses. Low waves rippled through stone, too gentle to disturb a single grain of sand. The Great Sphinx stood unmoved, its eyes half eroded and ancient as weather itself. Around its pores, cables snaked towards small metal boxes that fed into headsets and glowing dials. The air shimmered with heat, though beneath it ran another current, one that did not belong to wind or sun, but to a pulse deep in the bedrock. Inside a steel van station nearby, a technician rested his headphones over one ear and waited for the next echo to arrive. It came not as a bang or a rumble, but as a faint change in tone. He marked a notch on clear acetate film, tracing peaks that rose like the corners of a buried door. The frequency slipped through a narrow band of limestone and returned slightly delayed, just enough to say something hollow might be there. Each mark became a coordinate, each wave a possible outline. In the dim light, his pen hesitated as another line flattened unexpectedly, forming a perfect rectangle beneath the pores of the Sphinx. It was too neat to be a crack, and too isolated to be random layering. He wrote a note beside it, small and undecided. Cavity. The project had begun quietly with permission for what official called soil stability surveys. The equipment looked harmless, designed to measure density variations that might threaten monuments with unseen subsidence. The geophysicists came armed with low-frequency acoustic sensors and ground-penetrating transducers, slipping them into prefabricated slots cut near the base. Their plan was simple. They would send inaudible sound waves into the rock, time the rebounds, and translate each echo into a contour map showing what lay below. The waves traveled in pulses, some short as heartbeats, others stretched to 10 seconds, painting a subterranean picture by degrees of tone rather than light. The early test grid showed fluctuations typical of layered limestone compressions, pockets, and old fissures that had hardened centuries ago. But farther beneath the front pores, two returns came back louder than expected. They were not diffuse or ragged like natural gaps. The energy reflected sharply as if it had struck a wool plane. When the technicians adjusted the frequency, alternating between 25 and 75 hertz, the forms gained shape. One was roughly rectangular. Another was smaller yet symmetric. Both extended east to west. At an estimated depth of 25 feet, the voids ran parallel to each other with an alignment precise enough to disturb even cautious scientists. Not everyone on site agreed on what that meant. One of the Egyptian geological surveyors leaned against the equipment van and said simply that the rock here sometimes plays tricks. He had watched machines like this run before across temple platforms and ancient quarries. He spoke of air pockets and density shifts from salt veins. The American engineers nodded, polite but unswayed. They did not often see faults bind themselves in 90-degree corners beneath a monument carved from a single ridge of stone. In private, they marked their logs with faint notes, the small superstitions of science. The collaboration itself sat at an uneasy border. Half the funding had come from the Association for Research and Enlightenment, a Virginia-based group devoted to the prophecies of Edgar Cayce about a hidden hole of records. The rest was covered by scientists affiliated with the State University of New York, and a few Egyptian geophysicists interested in applied seismic mapping. This mixture of faith and academia created more friction than anyone admitted aloud. During fieldwork, the word Atlantis was never used, though it hung in the dry heat like static. By morning, film plots lay scattered across the instrument table. Pencil ticks and faint pen marks showed subsurface profiles. Most read as expected surface refraction. A few did not. One technician pointed to a chart where the wave path bent back on itself, forming a neat loop. He knew the rules of his discipline. Any shape that looked too artificial might simply be interference. Yet part of him lingered on the possibility that geometry itself could whisper. Later, as the sun crept higher over the dunes, he would pack the film canisters into cardboard sleeves and label them for shipping. Somewhere between data and story, the same heat haze quivered. When the results reached preliminary analysts, the wording in internal memos grew cautious. Anomalies of rectangular form, one summary read, with denser than expected margins. Public press statements, however, condensed it to inhomogeneities consistent with natural fissuring. The language of science often served as camouflage. The same data could stand on two legs depending on who looked. To the international sponsors and those who followed the sleeping prophet, the rectangular reflections meant chambers. They envisioned rooms sealed long before dynastic Egypt. To archaeology officials wary of outside claims, they were mere lesson plans to geology students. Every phrasing carried political weight, and caution became its own dialect. Supporters suggested that one chamber might connect inward toward the temple via a corridor carved along a slight incline. The symmetry of readings on both sides hinted at a linking passage. Some even proposed it as an ancient floodway or a ceremonial entry sealed during restoration phases in antiquity. Critics countered that any such shape could owe itself to fault compression and travertine deposits that formed straight-edge patterns. In truth, the evidence sat closer to pattern than certainty. They were rectangular signals in the dark whose resolution stopped just short of clarity. Behind the instruments, humans kept their own rhythm. The team leader, bearded and pale from the desert sun, wrote notes beneath a weak desk lamp. The paper smelled faintly of dust and plastic film. On one sheet, he sketched a simple map showing two cavities and an arrow leading toward the temple enclosure. The drawing looked more architectural than geological. He paused, wondering how much meaning could hide in a frequency echo and whether imagination had amplified it. Within weeks, news of the anomalies filtered beyond the lab. Rumors traveled through cafes in Cairo and reached radio hosts who preferred wonder to restraint. Hidden rooms discovered beneath the Sphinx, the headlines murmured. The official Egyptian Geological Survey, press for comment, confirmed only the presence of unusual subsurface features. That single phrase echoed louder than any instrument pulse. Scientists who had kept a neutral intent found themselves labeled the Atlantis team. Information, it seemed, obeyed politics faster than physics. Yet fragments of those results slipped quietly into later academic abstracts. Data tables omitted direct references to chambers but preserved measurements showing a depth of around 10 meters. A few Egyptian staff privately admitted the readings were too geometric for comfort. That quiet statement would never appear in journals, but it circulated among geologists like a shared rumor, the kind that surfaces only over coffee after conferences. Every discipline keeps its ghost stories, and this became one of them. The anomaly maps drawn across transparent film remain stored in archives. Inside those translucent sheets, the empty spaces looked almost living, like X-rays of thought caught under the limestone frame. One geophysicist described how, when holding the film up to the light, he could see the symmetry align eerily with the chest and paws of the monument. He did not publish that observation, not because it was unverifiable, but because it sounded too dreamlike for data. By the close of the field season, the desert regained its quiet rhythm. The wind passed over the plateau, slipping between the damaged features of the Great Lion. The excavation pits were filled, leaving only the faint outline of equipment tracks fading into the sand. Tourists resumed their photographs, unaware that beneath the pores lay lines on film suggesting a grid no one could dig down to see. The technicians boarded flights home with dust still clinging to their boots. The data, boxed and labeled, began its slower journey through layers of review that few outside the project would ever read. Late that year, during a private presentation to officials, a summarized set of scans were projected onto a white wall. Lines of brighter tone showed concentrated echoes. Solid here, hollow there. The attending director raised a brow but said little. It was enough that the presentation ended without commitment. No excavation followed. Permissions expired quietly. The final report noted a possible man-altered substructure, but it was bracketed with a phrase that it required verification. That verification never came. The instruments fell silent, but those rectangular voids did not erase themselves. They merely remained unaddressed, lying below as unread letters from the past. Some whisper that the reluctance to reopen the study stemmed from fear. It was a fear that aligning the old coordinates with modern science might blur the boundaries both sides needed to keep. Others dismissed this, pointing instead to budget constraints and preservation laws. Whatever the motive, the result was the same. Unverified data was sealed beneath bureaucracy as firmly as stone. In place of further tests came restoration work meant to stabilize the already fragile monument. The deeper readings would wait, perhaps for better instruments or for a time when politics could afford curiosity. Years later, digital copies of those seismic charts surfaced in private archives. The scans, faint yet unmistakable, marked anomaly zones under the front poles and extended streaks leading toward the Temple Trench. When comparing these to more recent radar imaging from the early 2000s, subtle overlaps appeared. Both indicated density channels and narrow signatures of space shaped by human intent or by chance symmetrical erosion. The coincidence lay too precisely along the temple axis to ignore. Some engineers found the alignment particularly striking. It was a quiet echo of architectural foresight that should not exist in random geology. In the quiet hours of their laboratories, a few researchers replayed the old sound files captured beside the Sphinx. The recordings were mostly white noise punctuated by faint reverberations. Still, one could almost hear a rhythm beneath the randomness. Listening to that static, they heard not proof, but potential. It was an architectural breath waiting in the limestone. For them, the monument no longer felt like dead rock, but a living archive translating through frequency. The legend of the Hole of Records, once dismissed as prophecy alone, now had coordinates named by physics itself. The next step should have been simple. They should have returned, verified, and excavated. Yet the more measurement approached that point of certainty, the more the politics stirred. Heritage ministries hesitated. Protective charters tightened. Joint project dissolved in paperwork. To this day, The anomalies remain officially unexplored. Beneath the official reports lies a thin trace of denial mixed with restraint. The desert still carries that low hum at night, the same resonance that moved through the instruments 3 decades ago. It is faint but steady, like a heart just beneath the stone, indifferent to permission, waiting only for another pulse of sound to find it again. When the data reached Cairo, it stopped moving. Boxes of charts and reels were brought into the ministry just after the morning call to prayer faded over the rooftops. Inside, the corridors breathed a kind of bureaucratic heat. Paper, dust, and sweat mixed with a faint scent of limestone clinging to field equipment. A clock logged the arrival and carried the documents through an unmarked door. By evening, the paper trail had already begun to vanish. The survey team who delivered their findings never received a receipt, only an assurance that a review would happen very soon. The seismic readings arrived with academic endorsements, yet they still carried a faint odor of controversy. The files included cross-sectional maps showing geometric voids, each labeled cautiously as potential low-density anomalies. Getting them cleared meant getting each label blessed by committee seals. Weeks went by without word, then months. While outside the ministry gates, the desert resumed its steady hush. Some accounts speak of the moment an internal memo circulated instructing that no reports concerning chambers or tunnels were to be released without central approval. Heritage protection was the official reason. Security was perhaps another. The geologists, used to the open sharing of records, found themselves caught in a different logic. It was a world where geological data could be treated like state secrets. The Sphinx, after all, was not just a hill or a cavern. It was a national symbol, and national symbols could not be tampered with lightly. An American researcher spent a week waiting for signatures that never came. Each day he sat in a courtyard that smelled faintly of diesel and hibiscus, his shirt growing salt rings in the noon glare. The reels inside his briefcase carried echoes from the plateau. They were reflections of pulses fired deep into the bedrock only weeks earlier. On each reel, a thin strip of magnetic tape hummed softly in its metal casing, holding what might have been the most detailed underground portrait of the Sphinx ever recorded. Yet each morning, the guard at the gate told him, "Not today." Inside that same compound, decisions were being shaped by competing pressures. Egypt had always walked the line between scholarship and politics, weighing foreign access against national stewardship. Gatekeepers publicly championed a narrative of continuity from pharaohs to nationhood. To them, a rumor of secret vaults built before the first dynasties was not just bad science. It risked becoming bad diplomacy. When journalists called for comment, the official reply was simple: no chambers confirmed. Yet among researchers, another phrase began to circulate: unexplained subsurface features. According to a few who saw early summaries, portions of the seismic data hinted at rectangular echoes too sharp to be dismissed as faults. The leaked abstract described zones of symmetry oriented exactly beneath the front pores. The coincidence was nearly impossible to ignore. If nature made those shapes, she had done so with a suspicious sense of geometry. Still, without excavation rights, the evidence could go no further. Subsequent proposals were swiftly rejected for endangering the foundation of the monument. Publicly, it was maintained that nothing unusual rested beneath the stone. Privately, some were less certain. Archives mention a brief midnight inspection with a radar unit borrowed from the military. Afterward, permits for all foreign-led surveys were suspended. The records fall silent there, leaving only the question of what the radar had seen or had not seen. The following year brought television specials portraying the seismic discovery as proof of ancient secrets. For authorities, it was an embarrassment. Cooperation had been negotiated for science, not spectacle. To restore control of the story, several standing permits were revoked. Within academic circles, the episode served as a warning. To flirt too closely with the mystical fringe meant your credentials might not survive the next grant cycle. Peer pressure did the rest. Anthropologists and geologists knew that careers could dry out faster than desert clay. To question the official timeline risked labels like pseudoscience. Many assistants were quietly advised to forget the anomalies if they wanted to finish their degrees. They did. Many did. Meanwhile, the association in Virginia continued funding expeditions, convinced their roadmap was bearing fruit. Their quiet sponsorship of radar tests blurred the boundary between science and spiritualism. On paper, these were standard geological surveys. In practice, they were part pilgrimage and part data gathering. When foreign press reports linked the funding back to old prophesies, the partnership dissolved overnight. Yet whispers suggest that some findings were quietly copied before repatriation orders arrived. By the mid-90s, censored documentaries mentioned a hidden shaft to the north. One claimed to show an official climbing into a narrow tunnel lined with blocks smoother than natural limestone. The footage was never released. Producers hinted that legal threats had frozen distribution. No one could confirm whether the film reel still existed. This pattern, a brief discovery followed by a bureaucratic blackout, became almost rhythmic. It was a choreography of near revelation. In academic journals, every mention of the void was stripped down to technical understatement. Localized heterogeneities. One line read, "The wording concealed more than it revealed." Outside peer-reviewed pages, cafes buzzed with rumors. Some said the data showed steps carved into the bedrock. Others swore it revealed chambers flooded long ago and refilled with sand. None could show proof. What remained was a silence. It was an absence thick enough to invite its own mythology. Those close to the surveys noted a peculiar shift. Once the data became controversial, conversations turned from geology to loyalty. A single mention of Atlantis could end negotiations before they began. The Sphinx now carried a political riddle. How could one study an object of faith without becoming part of a faith themselves? Facing the risk of shifting narratives, a sealed file drawer must have seemed like the safest sandbox. Years later, a quiet admission would surface from the same authority. An official acknowledged man-made spaces in proximity to the monument, but dismissed them as unrelated to any mythical archive. That choice of words, neither denial nor confirmation, traveled fast. Man-made spaces could mean anything from maintenance tunnels to unfinished tombs. But paired with memories of confiscated radar data, it sounded like an echo from those forbidden reels. Ownership of the subsurface image belonged not to the researchers who scanned it, but to the government. Asking for copies became equivalent to requesting classified material. This legal framing meant that even empty space beneath the stone could become confidential. The media cycles amplified the misunderstanding. Tabloids called it proof of secret vaults. Researchers who once dreamed of collaboration now retreated to safer topics like erosion analysis or restoration history. Their silence was a survival strategy. For those who persisted, the doors literally stopped opening. For Egypt, the matter appeared closed, and yet the data never disappeared. Copies circulated quietly between academics, half whispered like contraband. Some of these replicas, decades old, still sit on private drives. What they contain, no one publicly knows. But the fact they remain unpublished sustains the anomaly like a hidden heartbeat. It is inaudible but measurable by rumor alone. The story did not fade because measurements disproved the cavities. It faded because the conversation became dangerous. The Sphinx could endure storms, but controversy threatened the delicate balance of history. The compromise was neither excavation nor denial, but only postponement. Sometimes postponement lasts a lifetime. Now the findings drift between archive and myth. They are a memory of echoes once printed on film and stored in unmarked cases. Each rumor fills a vacuum left by each unanswered question. By now, the line between evidence and administration has blurred. The sealed boxes in Cairo hold both the magnetic tapes and the symbolic weight of unanswered possibility. Perhaps the Sphinx had found a new way to challenge humanity by making its watchers complicit in the riddle. The data might be restricted, but the echo under the pause has not gone anywhere. It waits, wrapped in protocols in the low hum of the desert, daring someone to listen again. From here, the trail widens towards stone that bears the mark of ancient rain. It leads to a geologist who claimed the monument remembered storms older than Egypt itself. In the quiet of the plateau, the surface of the rock begins to tell a different story, written in the language of water and time. The data didn't just show a hole. It showed a shape, a hard, right-angled geometry that defied the chaotic fractures of natural limestone. In 1991, when the seismic waves traveled through the bedrock beneath the right pore, they struck something that reflected energy with the precision of a mirror. For the geophysicist standing on the Giza sand, the monitor didn't just whisper of a cave. It signaled the presence of an intentional void, a rectangular chamber measuring roughly 12 by 15 meters, buried 25 feet deep. To those who grew up on the legends of Atlantis, it was the first evidence of the whole of records. But to those looking closer at the mechanics of the plateau, it suggested something even more unsettling. The anomaly wasn't just a room. It was a component, a piece of a larger, silent machine waiting for a signal that hasn't arrived in 12,000 years. If we entertain the idea that something mechanical lies beneath the Sphinx, we must change how we view the monument itself. It is no longer a tomb or symbolic guardian, but a sentinel in the truest sense, a device designed to monitor time or store energy. Edgar Cayce, the man whose trance readings first pointed scientists to that exact coordinate, often spoke of the records as being more than just parchment and stone. He described a library of knowledge that included the very instruments used by a lost civilization to harness the power of the sun and the vibrations of the earth. He called them the things that make one whole. In the language of a man from the early 20th century, that could mean medicine. But in the context of high technology, it sounds like a description of a power source or a resonance chamber. When the 1991 seismic survey led by Thomas DeBecke and Robert Schoch revealed a rectangular cavity, the scientific community scrambled to provide a natural explanation. They spoke of the weathering of limestone and the way salt water can hollow out soft pockets over millennia. Yet nature rarely creates perfect right angles in the dark. The symmetry of the void beneath the pores matched the symmetry of the monument above it, creating a vertical alignment that felt like engineering. Some researchers suggested that the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid were part of a single subterranean circuit, a network of tunnels and shafts that functioned like a massive lithic machine. If the Sphinx is the gateway, then the mechanical anomalies beneath it might be the ignition system. The tension between discovery and denial began almost immediately after the seismic results were published. The Egyptian authorities, led by the assertive Zahi Hawass, grew increasingly protective of the site. Permissions for deep drilling were denied. New radar surveys were restricted. This created a vacuum of information that was quickly filled by suspicion. If there was nothing there, skeptics asked, why stop the search? But the answer might be more complex than a simple cover-up. To admit that mechanical structure or an advanced library exists beneath the Sphinx is to admit that our entire understanding of human history is wrong. It would mean that before the first pharaoh ever wore a crown, there was a civilization that understood the Earth's mechanics better than we do today. Think about the precision required to carve a monument from a single ridge of stone and then hollow out a chamber beneath it without causing a collapse. The weight of the Sphinx is enormous. Any void beneath it would be subject to immense pressure. If that chamber has remained intact for thousands of years, it wasn't just dug, it was engineered. Some theories suggest the walls of the chamber are lined with material that prevents seismic interference, which would explain why modern radar often produces blurred or inconsistent images. It is as if the Sentinel is designed to be invisible to anything but the right kind of probe. In 1993, the mystery deepened when a television documentary brought these findings to millions of viewers. The narration spoke of secret doors and the possibility of an ancient repository of wisdom. For the first time, the world saw the seismic graphs, the jagged lines that flattened into a perfect rectangle beneath the pores. It was a visual confirmation of Case's prophecy, but the reaction from the academic world was a wall of silence. The documentary was criticized as sensationalist, and soon after, the team was barred from further exploration. The silent Sentinel was left alone once again, the desert wind slowly filling the small test pits with sand, as if the plateau itself wanted to erase the progress of the machines. But the machines had already heard the echo. Those who study the mechanical potential of Giza point to the resonance of the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx as a linked system. There are reports of low-frequency humming detected near the base of the monument during the quietest hours of the night. Acoustic engineers have noted that the limestone used in the construction of the plateau contains high amounts of quartz crystal. When subjected to pressure or specific sound frequencies, quartz can generate a piezoelectric charge. If the Sphinx sits atop a mechanical chamber, it could be part of a massive energy harvester, using the vibration of the earth or the movement of the Nile to generate power that we no longer know how to use. The idea of an awakening sentinel suggests that the monument is waiting for a specific event. In many ancient traditions, the Sphinx is associated with the turning of the Great Year, a cycle of roughly 26,000 years caused by the wobble of the Earth's axis. We are currently approaching the end of one such cycle. If the mechanical heart of the Sphinx is a time capsule, it may be programmed to reveal its secrets only when the stars align with its gaze. This would make the whole of records a literal time lock, a vault that cannot be opened by force, but only by the clockwork of the cosmos. Supporters of the mechanical theory point to the weird anomalies found in other parts of Egypt, like the massive granite boxes in the Serapeum of Saqqara. Those boxes are cut with a precision that modern stone cutters find difficult to replicate. They are too large for coffins and too perfectly sealed for simple storage. They look like components of a power plant. If such technology existed elsewhere, it is almost certain it would be at Giza, the most important site in the ancient world. The Sphinx, standing guard at the edge of the plateau, would be the most logical place to hide the master controls. Critics argue that we are simply projecting our own technological obsession onto the past. We see machines because we live in a world of machines. To an ancient Egyptian, the Sphinx was a living god, not a piece of hardware. But this ignores the physical evidence of the seismic scans. It ignores the specific geometry that nature does not provide. The rectangular void remains. It has not been debunked, only ignored. It sits in the darkness, 25 feet below the pores, a silent witness to a history that remains out of reach. Imagine for a moment that the chamber is opened. Inside, We don't find dusty scrolls or gold statues. We find rows of polished stone on metallic surfaces. We find devices that respond to the touch of a hand or the frequency of a human voice. This was the vision Edgar Cayce shared with his stenographers in the 1930s. He spoke of a treasure house of knowledge that would be found when humanity was ready to use it for peace rather than war. He warned that the rediscovery of this lost science would bring a reckoning. It would force us to confront our place in a cycle of civilizations that rise and fall with the stars. The search for the mechanical heart of the Sphinx continues in the shadows of the official narrative. Private researchers use satellite imagery and infrared thermography to look for heat signatures that shouldn't exist. They find traces of vertical shafts that bypass the known tunnels, leading straight down into the bedrock. They find evidence of moisture trapped in deep pockets, suggesting that the subterranean network might still be connected to the ancient water table of the Nile. Each piece of data is a new coordinate on a map that leads to the same conclusion. The sentinel is not empty. Perhaps the greatest secret is not what lies beneath, but why it was hidden so well. If the survivors of a great catastrophe built the Sphinx to guard their knowledge, they would have known that future generations would be curious. They would have known that we would eventually develop the technology to look through stone. The placement of the chamber beneath the pores is both an invitation and a warning. It is the most visible part of the monument, yet the hardest to reach without damaging the structure itself. It is a puzzle that requires both science and respect to solve. The story of the awakening sentinel is a story of our own potential. It asks us if we are ready to find out that we are not the first masters of this planet. As we stand on the Giza sand, looking up at the weathered face of the lion, we are looking at a mirror. The Sphinx has watched the rise and fall of every empire we have ever built. It has seen the sand bury its body and the sun bleach its stone. It knows the secrets of the geometry beneath its pores, and it keeps them with a patience that only stone can possess. The rectangular voids are there, the pulses of the seismic sensors on the film. The coordinates are mapped. All that remains is a signal. We are living in an age where the boundary between myth and measurement is becoming a thin line. The seismographs of the 1990s gave us a glimpse into a world that should not exist. They showed us that the silent sentinel is a heart of geometry and a history that refuses to stay buried. Whether it is a hole of records, a mechanical station, or a tomb of the first gods, the void beneath the pores remains the most significant unanswered question in archaeology. It is a mystery that vibrates with the pulse of an ancient machine, waiting for the day the sand finally gives up the ghost and the sentinel speaks at last. The desert has a way of swallowing the noise of the present. But for those who listen, the hum of the plateau is constant. It is the sound of a silent sentinel waiting for its time to return. As the sun sets over the pyramids, casting a long shadow across the lion's back, we are left with the eerie certainty that the story is far from over. The limestone keeps its secret, but the pulse goes on, beating beneath the pores, waiting for the hand that knows how to turn the key. The sentinel is not sleeping. It is watching, and it is closer to awakening than we have ever dared to believe.